Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to see you again on my channel. Today, I'm bringing you another deeply moving chapter in the journey of survival and hope of a single mother, lythica, and the man who has always silently stood by her side, Officer Hung, a man whose heart is warmer than any spoken promise. In the previous episode, thanks to Hung's genuine support, Hoai and her son finally had a roof over their heads. Though it was merely a small shelter made from bamboo, wood, and old tin sheets, it was enough to protect them from the sun and rain, and, more importantly, to give them a place they could finally call home. However, the storm had not yet passed. One gloomy afternoon, a well-dressed but cold-eyed woman appeared, the landlady's daughter, just returned from the city after a life of indulgence and recklessness. Drowning in debt due to excessive borrowing, she made a harsh decision to sell the very land her mother had allowed Hoai and her child to stay on. Without hesitation, she delivered a cruel ultimatum: you have 7 days. If you can't pay 6 million DND for the land, you need to move out. Faced with this, Hoai found herself in despair once more. She had no relatives, no savings, and no one to turn to for help. So the question now is, can Officer Hung, the quiet strength by her side, help her overcome this harsh new trial? Let's follow today's video to find out what happens next in this raw and emotional story. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss a single moment of Hoai's journey. Faced with pressure from the landlord's daughter to pay the rent within 1 week, Hoai had no choice but to put aside every other worry and throw herself into making money by any means necessary. She understood too well that if she couldn't gather enough money, she and her child would once again be cast out onto the streets, homeless, helpless. And this time, she was determined not to let that happen. She had nothing left but the strength of her body and the fierce determination of a mother. Without hesitation or complaint, she took on any job anyone was willing to offer. One early morning, while the fields were still blanketed in mist, Hoai showed up at a local rice paddy, asking to be hired for transplanting rice shoots, a task that required urgent labor. Cold water soaked her feet, and thick mud clung to every step. Her hands grew calloused as she repeatedly plunged young rice plants into the earth. As the sun slowly rose, her face, weathered by the sun, was drenched in a mix of sweat and muddy water. No one expected such resilience from a petite woman like her. Since she had no money to send her child to daycare, she carried him with her wherever she went. The little boy, only a few years old, was remarkably well behaved. She wrapped him on her back with an old cloth, tying it securely so he wouldn't fall. As she bent down to work, the child remained quiet, nestled against her back. His eyes occasionally opened to gaze at the sky, then gently closed again, as if, even at that young age, he understood that his mother was enduring everything for him. During her short break, she sat under a tree, unwrapping a plastic bag containing cold rice she had packed early that morning. With no side dishes, she dipped the rice in coarse salt, broke off a piece to feed her child first, then quietly ate the rest. Sometimes, exhausted beyond hunger, she would skip the meal altogether and just drink a little spring water before heading back into the field. When the afternoon came and her work in the fields was done, she didn't rest. Instead, she headed to a hillside garden to forage for leftover vegetables. She had asked the landowner for permission to gather what was left behind after the main harvest, in exchange for a small share or to resell for some earnings. She picked up stray sweet potatoes, unripe papayas, wild greens, one hand holding her child, the other selecting produce, her back soaked in sweat. When she'd gathered a full basket, she carried it to a nearby stream, carefully washing each vegetable and leaf as if they were the most precious things she'd found that day. Day after day, before sunrise, she left her shelter with her child in tow, not returning until late at night. While others sat down to warm dinners under golden lamplight, she was still at the small vegetable stall at the district market, gently calling out to passers-by to buy her goods. On rainy nights, when no one bought anything, she brought the produce home, sorted the salvageable ones to sell the next day, and cooked the spoiled parts into simple porridge, wasting nothing. Though utterly exhausted, Hoai never gave up. Every single coin earned brought her closer to the hope of keeping a roof over their heads. To her, there were no choices left, only one path forward: work. Work until her legs gave out, rest briefly, then work again. With all the strength of a devoted mother, she poured her soul into every little task, every breath, every gesture, all with one silent prayer: that her son would never have to live a life of wandering, never grow up without a home, never be lost in the cold indifference of the world. That afternoon, as the fading sunlight cast long shadows over the bamboo trees at the edge of the village, lytutien was carrying her child home from the market when a loud engine broke the stillness. A large motorbike screeched to a stop in front of her makeshift shack. On the bike were two people, a woman in a striking red dress, face heavily made up, exuding the same arrogant air as before, and beside her, a burly man with tattoo-covered arms and a menacing glare. It was the landlord's daughter, and with her, a thug of unknown background. She stepped off the bike, her high heels clicking sharply on the damp earth, walking straight toward Ca, who stood frozen with her child in her arms. No greetings, no sympathy for the weariness etched deep on the face of the thin, exhausted woman. She simply extended her hand. "Where's the money?" "I'm here to collect. It's been a week." "How much did you scrape together?" Ca trembled as she opened her bag, pulling out the money she had earned from transplanting rice, picking vegetables, and selling goods at the market. Crumpled bills, carefully folded and wrapped in cloth, were offered with both hands. "Sister, this is everything I've made this past week. Please, take it for now. I just need a few more days, I promise I'll pay the rest." The woman took the bundle, flipped through a few notes, then waved dismissively. "This? What can this even buy? Selling weeds at the market and thinking you deserve to stay on my land? Do you take me for a charity?" Stuffing the money into her purse, she turned to the man beside her and sneered, "What are you waiting for? Tear down that shack." Without hesitation, the man stepped forward, pulling a metal rod from the motorbike storage compartment. Ca immediately dropped to her knees, clutching her child tightly, her voice trembling and eyes filled with tears. "Please. I beg you, just a few more days. I have a small child. Where will we go? I'm not running away. I've given you everything I have. Please have mercy." The woman paused, clearly uncomfortable at the sight of Ca kneeling before her. Perhaps she hadn't expected a woman to humble herself so much just to protect a shack. But then she crossed her arms, tilted her head, and smirked. "Fine. Since you're begging so desperately, I'll give you 2 more days. 2 days. Not a minute more. If you don't have the full amount by then, pack your things and get out." With that, she signaled the thug to stop, then turned, climbed back onto the bike, and sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a heart-numbing silence in her wake. Ca collapsed onto the ground, holding her child close. The little one quietly rested his head on her shoulder, saying nothing. And as for her, her eyes were red, her hands clutched tightly around the old cloth. She had no more tears left to cry. Only silence remained, heavy and raw, as the light of day faded into the dim twilight. Dusk had fallen. After the 2 debt collectors had left, lytutien still sat motionless in front of her makeshift shack. The evening breeze swept through the loose tin roof, sending a biting chill deep into her bones. Her little son lay quietly on her lap, wide eyes staring at the sky. As for her, she could no longer hold back her tears. She hugged her son tighter and broke down. Her sobs were choked, as if every bit of pain, humiliation, and exhaustion she had buried inside suddenly surged out all at once. She had tried so hard. Every single coin she earned had been soaked in sweat and tears. Yet she was still looked down upon, cast aside, and treated like some nameless squatter who had no right to a place in the world. In the pit of despair, her thoughts drifted to Hung, the kind and quiet police officer who had once helped her in her darkest hour. She remembered the sincerity in his eyes as he handed her that first warm meal, and the gentle voice that still echoed in her ears. "If things ever get too hard, don't hesitate to come find me. I'll always be here." Back then, she had only nodded out of politeness. But today, with nowhere else to turn, he was the only one she could think of. Night had fallen completely. After lulling her child to sleep, she carefully tied the old cloth around her back to carry him, then quietly left the shack. Her aching legs dragged her along the uneven dirt road that led to Hung's home, a small, quiet house nestled beside a row of bamboo, with the warm glow of yellow light shining gently through a simple wooden window. She stood still at the front gate. Inside the yard, Hung was watering his potted plants by the porch. When he looked up, he immediately recognized her familiar figure. He stepped out quickly, surprised but glad. "Sie? What brings you here?" She lowered her head, clutching at the hem of her worn shirt. The cold wind made her hands tremble, but her gaze remained steady. Though her voice wavered, she tried to stay composed. I'm sorry for bothering you. I just wanted to ask if you still meant what you said that day. I need help." Hung didn't press for details. He simply nodded with quiet understanding. "Come inside first, it's cold out here. Let's talk over some tea." She hesitated, glancing toward the house, and gently shook her head. I don't dare. I'm afraid your mother will be upset. I know she doesn't like me. I just wanted to say a few words and go." Hung gave a soft smile, his tone calm and reassuring. "My mother's not home. She went to visit my aunt in the district a few days ago and probably won't be back for a while. Don't worry." Still, Hoai quietly shook her head. She remained outside and told him everything, about the landlord's daughter demanding money, the threats, and how she now had only 2 days before being forced to leave. Hung listened silently. Then, after a moment, he looked her in the eyes with firm resolve. "Don't worry. I'll take care of it. You've done everything you could. I won't let you and your son be thrown out again." She bowed her head as tears fell onto her sleeves. But this time, they were not tears of helplessness, they were tears of relief. Though she still refused to go inside, she thanked him repeatedly, then turned to carry her child back home. Hung watched her fragile figure fade into the dark path and couldn't bear the thought of her walking back in the cold night. He quickly brought out his motorbike, gently took the sleeping child from her back and laid him carefully on the back seat. Then he helped her up. "Let's go. It's too dark, let me take you home." Without another word, Hoai quietly sat behind him, leaning gently into the warmth of someone she now dared to call a shelter in the storm. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the village. After feeding her son, Hoai wrapped him onto her back and headed out to the garden, as usual. She quietly picked the freshest greens, gathered leftover sweet potatoes and cassava that others had left behind. The work was tiring, but she felt a rare sense of peace, because at least, the night before, she had spoken her deepest fear to someone she trusted. By midday, after selling her vegetables at the market entrance, she hurried home, her forehead beaded with sweat, hands still carrying the scent of soil and sap. As she approached her small shack, she was startled to see a familiar figure standing under the shade of a tree. It was Hung. He stood there in full police uniform, hands in his pockets, his face serious yet warm with the same familiar gentleness. As soon as he saw her, he stepped forward. "I knew they'd be coming today," he said calmly. "So I took some time off to be here with you." Ca was stunned. She hadn't expected Hung to remember, let alone care so much about what she had said the night before. A wave of unfamiliar emotion rose within her, part gratitude, part aching tenderness. She simply nodded, unable to say a word, and bent down to soothe her child, who had started to stir. Moments later, as expected, the landowner and her daughter arrived. The older woman stood silently behind, her expression cold and unreadable. The daughter, on the other hand, strutted in with her usual arrogant air, hands on her hips, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've thought it over," she declared. "If you want to stay here, you pay the proper price, $3 million a month, paid annually. If you can't afford it, then get out." Ca was stunned. That amount was many times the original rent, far beyond what she could possibly afford. But before she could respond, Hung stepped forward. His gaze sharpened, and though his voice remained calm, it carried the firm weight of authority. "You're illegally renting out agricultural land for residential use. If you want to settle this properly, we can go to the commune office and talk it through. On top of that, the price you're demanding has no basis, it's well above the regional average. If you continue to threaten and exploit tenants with unreasonable demands like this, you may face legal penalties." The two women froze. The daughter let out a nervous laugh. "I was just trying to negotiate a little. No need to get all worked up." Hung didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed an envelope to the elderly landowner. "Here is $250. This is a down payment for a 1-year lease. The remainder will be paid monthly, and I will be the official witness on the contract. I hope you'll accept this and stop making things more difficult." Both women were taken aback. The mother nodded silently. The daughter simply shrugged and walked off, reluctant but defeated. The yard returned to its quiet stillness. Ca stood frozen in place. She had never imagined Hung would use his own money to help her. This wasn't charity, it was a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a storm. She clutched the edge of her shirt, tears rolling down her cheeks, this time, not from despair, but from overwhelming emotion. Hung turned to her and said softly, "Focus on your work. Take care of your child. And if things get hard again, don't hesitate to come to me." With that, he got on his bike and returned to work, not waiting for any thanks. Ca watched him disappear down the small hill. Her heart clenched with too many emotions to name. Since losing her parents, since being cast out into the world like an unwanted outcast, this was the first time a man had treated her with genuine kindness, no agenda, no pity. And she knew then. That quiet act of kindness had already changed the fate of her and her child. The next day, Hung's mother returned home after spending a few days at her younger sister's house. As soon as she stepped into the village lane, she overheard whispers from a group of women gathered by the communal well. Their eyes no longer held the usual warmth when they looked at her. Instead, there were sideways glances, lifted chins, and words laced with subtle scorn. "Heard your son's been hanging around that single mother near the dike while you were away." "That's right. Even helped her rent land." "What, planning to marry her or something?" "A woman like that, becoming a daughter-in-law of a government officer's family? Sure, pity is one thing. But marrying her? Please." Though none of it was said directly to her face, each word was like a blade slicing into her pride. By the time she reached home, her irritation had boiled over. That evening, when Hung returned, she called him into her room with a stern voice. "I don't want to hear any more rumors. You're a police officer," someone was standing in the community. "You can't be associating with a widowed woman with a child, whose background is unclear and questionable. From now on, I forbid you from seeing her again." Hung froze for a moment, struggling to stay calm, though disappointment flashed in his eyes. "Mom, I'm just helping someone in need." "Helping? What man helps someone by going over day after day? I've heard enough. You're still young, talented, there's no shortage of proper girls out there. Let me be clear, I'll find you someone worthy of our family." Hung said nothing more. He knew his mother was stubborn, arguing would only make things worse. That afternoon, with the day off, he quietly left the house without telling her. A heavy weight pressed on his chest. He hadn't made any promises to CA, but he knew deep down that he couldn't just look away while she fought every day to raise her child in silence and hardship. He walked down the narrow dirt path that led to the shack by the dike, the very spot where, just days before, he had stood up for her in the dispute over land. When he arrived, CA was sweeping the front yard. Upon seeing him, she smiled with quiet relief. "Officer Hung, you're off today? I was just about to bring some vegetables to the market early tomorrow. Glad you stopped by." Her little boy ran over to him, burying his head against Hung's leg like a child already familiar with his presence. Hung bent down and ruffled the boy's hair, a gentle smile softening his face. After a moment of hesitation, CA offered shyly, "I made sour soup and some braised fish today. If you don't mind, would you stay and eat with us? It's not much, but it's all homemade." Hung looked into her sincere eyes, then nodded. They sat down to a simple meal under the modest shack roof, 3 bowls, a pot of steaming sour soup, and a plate of fragrant braised fish. The air was humble, yet deeply warm. CA didn't speak much. She quietly served more rice to her son now and then, occasionally glancing at Hung with a wordless gratitude in her eyes. And Hung, he, too, said little, but he felt something stir in his heart, something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine connection and peace. But neither of them knew. From afar, hidden behind a clump of bamboo, Hung's mother stood watching. She had grown suspicious and had followed her son, and now, what she saw ignited a storm within her. She saw Hung lift the child, sit beside CA, sharing a meal like a true family. To her, this was no longer mere pity, it was affection. And that was something she could not accept. Her heart clenched. She felt betrayed, humiliated. To her, CA was a threat, a stain that could tarnish the reputation and status the family had upheld for generations. In that very moment, she swore silently to herself. No matter what it takes, she would tear them apart. She would never allow her son to fall into the hands of a woman she deemed unworthy. So, what will Hung's mother do next now that she's determined to stop this relationship at all costs? Will a new storm soon descend upon Hoai, CA and her son? And what will become of the bond that has only just begun to blossom? Stay tuned for the next episode to uncover the emotional and dramatic turns in a journey where fate still has many trials in store for them.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người ơi, hôm nay thì kênh của mình có lên thêm một nội dung nữa là nội dung về câu chuyện của Lý Hoài Ca và cảnh sát Hùng á mọi người. Như câu chuyện này thì hồi bữa mình cũng có lên một lần rồi, nhưng mà cũng cách đây, cái tập đầu tiên thì cũng cách đây khá là xa. Do hôm nay thì mình sẽ quyết định lên thêm một tập nữa để cho bữa sau mình sẽ lên đều 2 nội dung trên kênh nha mọi người. Từ ngày mai trở đi thì mình sẽ lên cả nội dung về Lý Hoài Ca và cảnh sát Hùng nữa, chứ không riêng nội dung của Lý Từ Diệp. Mình mong rằng mọi người có thể ủng hộ cái nội dung mới này, cũng như là ủng hộ cho kênh của mình nhiều hơn nha. Tại vì mọi người cũng có thể biết là về tiến trình của bộ phim Lý Tử Diệp thì nó tiến trình khá là chậm. Vì thế mình sẽ xen thêm, và có thể trong tương lai nữa thì mình sẽ xen thêm nhiều câu chuyện tình yêu của các nhân vật khác nữa. Thì mong rằng luôn nhận được sự ủng hộ của mọi người, và mong rằng mọi người sẽ góp ý nhiều hơn để kênh mình có thể hoàn thiện và ngày càng phát triển hơn nha.